Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to I-SAPS Education Podcast. Over the years, Pakistan's education system has seen considerable improvements in terms of better access to education, improved service delivery, increased human resource, and more budgets allocated for education. While the quality of education has also improved, still Pakistan has a steep student learning challenge where many students are still unable to achieve the desired level of competencies. Various data sets also emphasize low performance of students. Recently, the results of TIMS were released, and unsurprisingly, we are at the bottom of the list. Given the magnitude of the learning challenge facing Pakistan, we believe this is time that the issue is discussed and deliberated upon, especially considering the current pandemic. Through this podcast, we aim to communicate the gravity of the challenge, its implications for children and the larger economy, and more importantly, what role can the stakeholders play in improving the situation. To discuss this, we are pleased to have Koen Geven with us today. Koen is an economist at the World Bank and leads a number of projects across South Asia. Koen's research focuses on the dynamics between inequality, public policy, and education. He has a keen eye on Pakistan's learning challenge and has undertaken several studies on the topic. Thank you, Kun, for joining us, especially considering that it is still 6 a.m. in the morning in DC.
Thank you very much, Abdullah, for having me. It's my pleasure to join you.
So, Kun, 2020 has been a turbulent year for education as schools remained closed for a major part of the year. We have all been concerned about the learning loss for students. You recently did some simulations to analyze the potential impacts of COVID-19 school closures on schooling and learning outcomes. We would like to hear your insights on the learning challenge of Pakistan before COVID-19 and what are the implications of the pandemic on student learning. I'll just bring on the presentation.
Abdullah, actually, let me try and share it from my screen because maybe it will be quicker if.
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay. Let me see. So let me know if you can see the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, we can see that.
Excellent. Okay, so no, thank you so much again, Abdullah, for having me and also for taking the initiative to discuss this topic from a data-driven view. I really see you and I-SAPS as one of those unique places in Pakistan that brings insights into the landscape, ask questions about what's happening, and thinks really innovatively about what we can do about the learning crisis, and so I really appreciate the chance to share some of my work here, and just to let you know that this is not just work that I'm working on. We're working on this really as a team in the World Bank with a variety of experts. I think some of my colleagues are also on the call. Amer Hassan, who is a senior economist in the bank, Aisha, who is coordinating some of the research that we're doing, and then we have a variety of professors involved as well that are sort of thinking along with us about this work, which we all see as the great challenge for Pakistan. In my presentation today, what I'll try and do is give you a little bit of background and try and convince you that the crisis of COVID is actually part of a twin crisis. And the twin crisis is a learning crisis that was already in Pakistan. And then on top of that comes this pandemic, which leads to very long school closures and creates an additional challenge for the school system that is almost unprepared to deal with these two massive challenges. And for that, to try and convince you of that, I'll try and dig a little bit into the data. I'll show a lot of graphs and figures and numbers. I hope that that it won't dazzle too much, but I try, and wherever I give a presentation, to really show as much data as possible, because what I initially heard when we released some of this data was that some of this is a surprise. And what I try and do in my presentation is show you maybe this is not as much a surprise as it is, because most of the answers, most of these issues are already there in the data, but we need to ask questions from it. We need to look at it and figure out what we can do about these sort of protracted and sticky issues. So let me tell you a little bit just into the structure of the presentation. One is, where were we before this pandemic? So what's sort of the trajectory that Pakistan was on? Two, then, given that background, how is this pandemic impacting children in Pakistan? So what are sort of the mechanisms that lead this pandemic to impact children? And then third, and I'll get into that, of course, a little bit later, because it will take me a little bit of time to set this up. Then what are we learning from the data coming out from the field in the last few months? And how is this maybe changing the way we think about education and what we really need to do, what our joint challenge is? Okay, so where were we before the pandemic? Now, I think this is probably data that most of you are familiar with. I think it's a refrain, thanks to some very strong activism and public discussion, to say that Pakistan has an enormous out-of-school challenge. And so even very recently, it was, I think, 27% of students aren't still going to school, which means that Pakistan is now getting 73% of children enrolled in primary education, which is low, and it means that Pakistan has a very large absolute population of children out of school, which is in the region of about 20 million children. And what I think is important about this is that Pakistan is still lower than its neighbors, who have more or less solved or addressed this problem. And so in South Asia, Pakistan is actually pulling down the average. The other thing to note is that there is quite a bit of variation, and so difference in Pakistan, with children in Punjab having a much higher chance to go to school than children in Balochistan, who are really almost at the bottom because of a variety of issues. Now, secondly, is that even if children make it into school, very few actually learn the basics of the curriculum. And so, according to Pakistan's own data, which was collected by NIS over several rounds of national assessments, where we've looked into the data, which seems to be quite decent, only about 35% of children who are in school and stay in school actually reach minimum learning proficiency by age 10. So the curriculum itself is not getting into the brains of the children. What the teacher does every day in the classroom is not translating into learning of the basics in children. And another way to think about this is just that there are many children who are going to school every day, but did not understand what the teacher was trying to tell them, did not pick up what is in their textbooks right in front of them. And clearly it takes them very long to get there. It's not that these children never learn to read. Some of them will never learn to read, but it takes them a lot longer than their peers across most of the world. And you can see other countries that are comparison. Sometimes people say maybe that's because of low GDP, because of economic issues, but even some countries which are at a similar level of economic development as Pakistan are doing much better on these numbers. Now, if we put these two problems together, which is an out-of-school problem and a learning problem, we see that adding everyone up, 75% of children are either out of school or they do not learn to read by age 10. And we call this problem learning poverty. So these are children who are sort of they're not getting the very basics from the education system. And just like economic poverty, this is causing a lot of long-term problems for children. They are not able to pick up reading. They will not get a leaflet from the doctor that they understand. They will not be able to catch up with the news in the country. And they won't be able to interact in some basic job-related situations. And so we want to think of this as a problem like poverty that requires all our attention and really rally around solving this issue, because I do believe that this is something that we can solve and bring down with a collective effort if we wanted to. We released these numbers. These are not necessarily new numbers. We released those numbers about a year ago in December 2019, if my memory doesn't fail me. And we got some discussion with various stakeholders about whether these numbers are correct. Are we in the ballpark? Yes or not? Is it maybe 60%? Is it maybe 80%? And I think what we've learned since then, also with the TIMSS numbers coming out that you referenced, Abdullah, is that probably these numbers are maybe actually worse than we predicted. So with high quality data coming in and showing us what children really learn in school, it may be that this number in actuality is even higher. And that just reminds us, I think, that we need to take this problem very, very seriously. Now, to give a sense of history and why not maybe everything is lost, is that Pakistan has been on a trajectory of improving things for its children. Coming from the 90s, boys have really increased their chances of going to school at an early age, and particularly boys in Punjab now have an almost 90% probability of going to school in their lifetimes at an early age, an appropriate age of going to school. And what's even more encouraging is that girls, particularly in Punjab, have also improved their odds of going to school. Actually, this particular gender difference, which was very sticky and very big in Punjab, has been almost resolved with about 84% or 85% of girls going to school at some point in this early age. But then it also shows you that the challenge that across the country things have improved, but they have not been improved enough. So there's still an enormous population that doesn't go, as you know, to school in this late age. And so it's something that requires more sustained effort across the country and in different places, and hopefully we can find ways of doing that. The other thing is, if we look at learning outcomes, and what's a little bit challenging is that we don't have solid data which allows us to track learning outcomes over time in Pakistan. The fact that Pakistan participated in TIMSS, which I think is really something to be celebrated, was a first for Pakistan. And so getting into this kind of comparable data internationally, but also over time, allows us to understand what's going on. Now, with the data that we have in Pakistan, we can do something similar, and we can try and track, at least on some basic indicators, what's happened. And so using the ASAR data, which I think many of you are familiar with, we can try up at least a picture of reading over time. This is not reading with understanding. This is just reading a paragraph aloud. But we see that the lines here have improved a little bit, maybe between 2018 and 2019, so right before the pandemic. Things had improved a little bit, but overall, this is a picture of virtually flatlining. And I think to understand this, we need to remind ourselves is that with the previous picture, there are more children coming into school over time. And these new children who are coming into school are typically from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So it is more challenging to teach them, right? And so I think we are seeing here sort of teachers maintaining the same outcomes on average, but actually their job and the challenge of their job is increasing over time. But still, it shows that not much has improved for the country as a whole. The other thing we can see is that I tried to say before that children do learn across their grades. So things improve over time, but they are not getting to absolute levels where we can be happy. So between grade 3 and 5, the amount of letters, say, that children can correctly recognize per minute, or the amount of words they can read per minute, which is a sense of fluency, which is absolutely fundamental to learning to read. It just gets to such a low level that this is about the average of an American preschooler. And just to give you a sense of why I think in Pakistan we can do so much better. Now, in that background, which was already clearly a crisis, and that's just the numbers, how did we expect the pandemic to impact that existing crisis? Well, let's first remind ourselves again of the timeline of this pandemic. So I remember that I was in Pakistan, I think on the week of the 10th of March. So it was right before the lockdowns happened. And we were having several conversations about that this pandemic is much bigger than we expected. We will see a number of school systems closing down, and they were closing down right at that moment. And Pakistan looked at the evidence with its health experts, and really very quickly, maybe overnight, decided to follow that evidence, and with many countries around the world closed its schools. And just to give you a sense of that Pakistan was not alone, we saw over 80% of countries in the world doing the same, with almost 1.6 billion children who were out of school at that period, which is something we'd never seen before in the world. Pakistan also then had a total lockdown starting in April 1, which lasted just over a month. And then progressively we got into a space of school openings starting in September 15, school closes again, and now we're again in the state of slowly reopening and trying to see whether things are improving a little bit. So this is a timeline where families are really trying to scramble and to organize themselves, and that's that fact of school closures is something quite complicated. Very early in the pandemic, we started joint work with a number of my colleagues to try and figure out how this could affect children. And we came up with a diagram which is a little bit complicated and which has several parameters. Because what we wanted to do is build a model of a relatively simple model in which we could predict how this would affect learning over time. And the fundamental things here are really very simple, and I'll just try and run through them very quickly. So the basic assumption is that children go to school and they learn something, which is something we know that they do. And when they are not in school, children tend to forget stuff that they have learned, which is also something that's backed up by the evidence. And so what we did is look at several parameters and how they would affect that learning. So one is to see how much children in an average school year learn. Two is how long would the school closures last in different scenarios of 3 months, 5 months, or 7 months, which we thought were sort of realistic scenarios of what countries could be doing. And the third thing that we looked at is that the pandemic is, of course, a learning crisis, an additional learning crisis on top of the learning crisis that already existed. But it's also an economic and financial crisis because families are losing income. They're also not able to go to work, and that is also affecting families' decisions. So those are sort of the three big factors. Now, how does that go to learning? Is one further complication, or maybe thankfully this is a complication, because countries are trying to also mitigate the effects of this. One is that they're using remote learning, such as television or e-learning, or even just learning from the textbooks at home to try and address this. So we wanted to look at how effective that is likely going to be and how much of the learning loss this can actually mitigate. The other thing we looked at how family income is coming into this is that, of course, for families who are well off and who are rich, losing a little bit of income is not as big a problem as if you're if you're poor and the income that you have is basically providing the food for you on the table. So we try to understand a little bit how different groups would be impacted by this economic crisis. And then we try to understand, one, the effect on learning, and two, the effect also on enrollment. So these two big problems that Pakistan is facing in its education system. And we come up with a number of measures to try and make that somehow understandable in terms of the effect. We can delve a little bit more into this if anyone has any questions. But let me show you the main results, which we published in a paper I think 4 or 5 months back together with Amr Hassan. So one is this question of dropouts, and so the thing in Pakistan is that families are very sensitive to economic effects in sending their children to school or not, more so than in most other countries in the world. And so we actually expect the dropouts to be quite substantial and in the region of about 1 million children. So that's a very large number, and that seriously affects the challenge that the country has, because it's very difficult to get these children back in school and to get them learning even if they're out of school. The second thing is that the learning adjusted years of schooling, which is sort of an aggregate of both learning and the time spent in schooling goes down from about 4.8 to 4.5 in our intermediate scenario. And then the third thing is that learning poverty increases. So even I said before, we were in 75%, and our expectation is that it will become 79% in Pakistan overall, with various provinces at different levels. And so the challenge has become bigger by a substantial margin, and so this requires a response. The other thing that we try to unpack is, okay, this affects all children in the average, but it may affect girls and boys in different ways, and that's something that we also try and understand. We're particularly concerned about girls for 3 reasons. One is that we already know that families in Pakistan invest more in their boys education careers, have higher expectations for their boys' education than for girls. Two, with girls, and particularly adolescent girls, being at home, we see shifting household roles, with girls taking up more of the burden of care for their children. And third, with sort of the public eye on a health crisis, we were concerned that families will think that maybe it's not safe to send their girls to school anymore, which is one of the reasons that one of the key reasons that they do not send their girls to school in the first place. So that's why we're particularly concerned about girls. But we're also concerned about boys. Why? Is because with the loss of income that many families observed, is that maybe families are becoming more likely to pull their boys back from school and send them to the market or send them to the fields to generate income for the family. And so this crisis is also a gendered crisis. And if we want to help families with those kinds of decisions, we need to give them the right tools to do so for both boys and girls. Okay, let me stop here and pause here for a moment, Abdullah, just to say how we saw Pakistan before and how we expect this crisis to impact, and then I can tell maybe a little bit later on what we're learning from the recent evidence.
Thank you so much, Koen. This was very insightful presentation, and it is very pertinent to see where we stand and how the pandemic has in fact impacted our education system in general and learning opportunities for the children in specific. Let's start a conversation on a lighter note. You shared an interesting data point in your presentation, and I'd like to zoom in on that and have your thoughts. You shared that around 75% of the children in Pakistan are facing learning poverty. Now, if this is the state of affairs, aren't the parents right in not sending their children to school for the simple reason that the time spent in schools does not get translated into quality learning experience for their children?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Abdullah. I think 2 points here. So one is that I can tell you from having faced school closures myself in my family, that one of the reasons we send our children to school is not for learning, but it's also to allow ourselves to work and to and to have a little bit of peace sometimes. So there's a childcare function of education which is very, very important, and children enjoy that very much. I can say too, and they miss school when they're not in school. So I think there's sort of a natural reason for families to send their children to school. In that sense. The second thing is that I think it's not that children do not learn anything in school. Yes, there are definitely children in the classroom who are not catching up, but they're still picking up some basics in terms of some letter recognition that we see clear progress on, and if we track children over time, which a number of surveys have done, we do see that eventually they are getting the basics. They're just not getting to a level where they are really getting the core of the curriculum, and so it's still very confusing for children. Now, I think if we turn your question around, if we improve the quality of education, are more children going to come to school and stay in school longer? I think the answer is yes, but I think it's not that bad that children will not want to come to school anymore. And in fact, if we ask children themselves whether they want to go to school and whether they enjoy going to school, the vast majority, maybe close to 95% of children say, yes, very much, I want to go to school. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koen. And so, across the globe, many countries must have tried to deal with the learning continuity challenge through different interventions. I'm talking specifically about the current pandemic. In your view, what are some of the practicable and doable interventions that are relevant for Pakistan, which could be implemented without much reliance on resources? You understand that we are short on resources for a number of things, but so what can be done for the case of Pakistan?
Yeah. Several things, and actually, I think the great thing, particularly about the beginning of the pandemic, is that policymakers in Pakistan have been very responsive to this crisis. They were very quick to look at the evidence on the pandemic as such, and so the school closures came at an appropriate moment. Two is they also sat around the table themselves with a number of individuals, organizations that are very concerned about education in Pakistan, and came up with various plans about how to combat this pandemic. So one is the energy I think that Pakistan has seen in the space of remote learning, setting up television channels and making sure that learning can continue at home, which is really essential. We wanted to make sure, and I think Pakistani policymakers and others wanted to make sure that there is some sense of continuity, even if children are at home. And I think that's happened. It, of course, can still be improved, and we can still learn from doing that. And in fact, is not something that seems to cost very much because it's done at scale for everyone, and the cost goes into developing the content. The second thing that I think was very important is and has actually happened is the planning for reopening. So knowing how to reopen, and making sure that when children come to school, it's actually a safe environment. There are standard operating procedures, as everybody knows, in place, and so I think that's also happened. Now, where I think are the next challenges that we'll need to focus on. So one is that we need to get a much better sense of the problem. So the diagnosis of the actual learning loss is key, because the data that I've shown you so far, these are simulations. They are coming out of the computers that we're running these models on, but they aren't the hard data. And the teachers and the school leaders and the parents cannot just see into the brain of the child and see how much they have forgotten when they come back to school. But there are tools that we can use that are very low cost and are used in Pakistan every day, such as basic assessments, tests, to try and figure out what children actually know. And so giving those tools in the hands of teachers into the classrooms, or maybe even in the family homes, to talk to children and see how much they have lost is, I think, crucial, because that allows us to respond. And then on top of that, there needs to be a remediation program where teachers are told and maybe supported to do that, how they can recoup or recuperate what's been lost. So I think a program in Pakistan is needed that sort of resets the clock and says, okay, we're going to focus this year on the basics. Let's forget maybe about the things that happen in the board exams a few years from now. Let's reset and make sure that everybody understands what a basic text is about. Can read that text, can understand the text. Let's reset the clock and make sure that everybody understands the basic mathematical functions again. And sort of that reset in the education system as a whole will allow for a remediation of the learning loss that has happened, and will probably benefit everybody, even if there was not this pandemic, given that there are just so many children in the school system that are at a loss. Now, I don't think that's a very expensive thing. It's maybe difficult to get every teacher committed to helping with it, but it's really a coordination problem more than a financial problem, because what we then need is a communication between the departments and the teachers. We need conversations between teachers about how we can make that happen, and I think that's in fact the bigger challenge. As you noted yourself in the beginning, the finance for Pakistan in education has been increasing. I don't think it's still nearly enough for the country to tackle this problem, but really also what is needed is this sort of coordination. And so what we've been trying to do over the last few months programmatically is find ways of, say, communicating with teachers at scale. Maybe using text messages to send to teachers and to families as well about the basic things that are needed to continue learning. Using platforms like we are using today, like Teams and Zoom and WebEx, to be able to talk to each other and to learn new ways of teaching and remediating learning losses. Those are the kind of things that we really should be discussing more programmatically.
Yeah, thank you, Koen. But I also agree with your point. We also need to learn from what we have implemented. For example, we were very quick in implementing the Talim Ghar initiative for Punjab, the teleschool at the federal level, and number of other initiatives by the other provinces. We need to learn why they could not bring about the desired changes. So if we look at number of surveys, the uptake of these solutions had been very low. Very few students benefited from these solutions. So I agree that we need to learn from whatever has been implemented and improve it in the coming times. And also, I think your point about coordination, that is very apt. And we need to have a coordinated effort, and we need to have a thing in place where, in case of any future such instances, we are able to respond very quickly and effectively as well. So I would also like to ask, what space has this learning challenge, overall learning challenge, and specifically in case of the COVID pandemic, what space has this learning challenge created for the likes of World Bank and other development partners, and how have they contributed towards addressing the challenge?
Yeah, thank you, Abdullah. I think there are two layers to this question, and I'll show maybe later some of the slides also to show you where we're trying to innovate. But one is that we were as struck by the crisis, I think, as everyone, and so particularly in the initial weeks and months, we've been really trying to have conversations around what we can do, and not just with ourselves in education, but also learning from our health colleagues, from others, in trying to respond, and then having information for policymakers on what they can do. So we've been just building out a web of resources on our website, in sort of the conversations that we have, by giving data and making sure that we have a good picture of what's really happening, and to make sure to really help policymakers to make better decisions about the pandemic. I think that was number one. The second thing is that, of course, we are a financial institution. And so we try to mobilize emergency funds, or look within our projects that are already taking place, to mobilize funds to really respond to the crisis. Because we were hearing very clearly from policymakers, including in Pakistan, that they needed funds to combat this problem. And so we have done that, and most of our programs, we had a big emergency program in Pakistan that helped, for instance, support some of the remote learning actions, and also in our provincial projects, we really tried to find the funds, and we did, to make sure that the provinces can also respond. And that's something that we continue to do, because this pandemic wasn't just the first few months, but it's really going to stay with us from in the next few months and really years, because this cohort of students, we expect to see lifelong effects for them. And so I think that is really our responsibility. Now, that maybe the third thing is, what's our collective responsibility in your question, and this is where I'm very positive, because I've seen many initiatives, not just by the bank, but by organizations like yourselves, by civil society organizations, by researchers, by companies that are coming in and saying, we have some ideas, we would like to contribute, even if it's not profitable. We would like to contribute and help solve this problem because we feel it ourselves. Our own children are affected, and I think that energy, that sense of responsibility, is something that we'll continue to need and hope to call upon, to overcome this crisis, but also the bigger problem that was already there in the background. So I think this is actually an opportunity for organizations to come together and address this problem jointly, because that kind of cooperation, I think, is the only way to address this problem.
Thank you, Koen, and I acknowledge that the support of stakeholders has been very instrumental in addressing some of the challenge. It could have been much worse if the support was not available. Koen, on a separate or on a similar trajectory, I would like to ask you. You've worked in the education sector of Pakistan. I wanted to have your insights on the level of preparedness that our education departments have in dealing with emergencies, contingencies, and disasters in general. How prepared are we in learning continuation in such situations? Because this is not the first time that has happened. It may happen in future also, God forbid. But what is our level of preparedness on this?
Yeah, no, that's right, Abdullah. I think departments have a level of preparedness. I think they've learned, and Pakistan is, in this sense, has had a number of crises in the last few decades that are important. One, of course, being the floods, which have been very very shocking for the country, affected a lot of schools and a lot of families. Two is also we know the effects of the earthquake, and the interesting thing is that because of that, there's also been research about the effects of these big crises in Pakistan. So, for instance, the paper by some of Pakistan's eminent researchers about the effects of the earthquake shows that these effects are really long term, and so that, I think, automatically factors into the decision making. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why policymakers were so quick to respond initially. Now, the level of preparedness of dealing with such a large problem, I think is not at the level it should be, and I think that reflects just maybe the organization of departments to deal with the problem of learning at scale, maybe more broadly than just the pandemic preparedness itself. So, absolutely, I think are trying to figure out how we can improve preparedness for future crises, and I think it's a guarantee there will be future crises. Hopefully not like this one with a pandemic, but other types of crises will absolutely come. With the climate changing, we know that there will be particularly climate shocks coming, and so I think that's a collective responsibility we have also, is to learn lessons and improve our emergency preparedness for the future, set in place more resilient systems. So one very important thing, for instance, is the importance of cash. That's something we're learning. So families, when they get a crisis, it's not just how our departments respond, but also how families respond. And we need to have better systems in place to get cash to families very fast. And so that's something that I think the Pakistan government is moving very fast on, and will really help us to overcome these kinds of issues.
Thank you, Koen. Now the million-dollar question. There is no doubt that we need to plan better to avoid the learning crisis. We have long been analyzing the state of affairs and have also planned for this to some extent. What do you think should be done by me, you, our organizations, government, parents, and other education actors to address the crisis in general and minimize the challenge posed by COVID-19?
Okay. Thank you. No, that's definitely the million-dollar questions. And I'm trying to answer this question myself in my own work. So I think part of this is that we need to take the responsibility to learn. Now, let me try and show you like a few data points where I think are informative for that kind of discussion. So what we've been trying to do over the last 6 months is just make sure that we listen to what's happening inside families' homes, what that we're trying to figure out what's going on in schools when they reopen, what people think, and what they're actually doing. And I think as long as we have that sense of realism, we can make a better policy. So we have a survey in place. There's an intervention that we're trying to layer on top of this, which is very simple. Is using text messages to try and nudge families to stay engaged with schooling, to come back to school when schools reopen, and to inform them about what they can do in their homes to really stay engaged and stay learning. Now, the interesting thing for this discussion is that means that we have sort of a sample of children from which we can figure out what's happened. So the number one thing that we're learning is that this crisis for families is primarily an income crisis, right? So 1/3 of families that we spoke to had lost a substantial share of income. And that's how families are sort of perceiving this. Income employment, also in other surveys, is seen as the main concern of household. Yes, health is also a concern, but it's only for about 15%, which is important and needs a response. But the economic crisis, we really need to think about what's going on in those families and how we can overcome. And even in earlier data, we saw that many more households were actually suffering income losses. Now, a second thing that we're finding out is that that we tend to be very optimistic about technology, and that's true because a lot of families now have cell phones, a lot of families have a television, but that's not universal. So there's still a lot of children who are not able to access devices. Another thing is that the internet, which is often seen as a solution, is really only present in a minority of households, and so there's still a digital divide on top of a device divide that we need to address, and that's something that I think we need to focus on in our programming. But we also need to circumvent sort of in our remote learning efforts. Now, what I think is very important is that we understand time use. So, what are the actual number of hours that a girl and a boy spend learning or are allowed to spend on learning and other tasks? So we know, for instance, that girls are spending a little bit more time on household tasks, that boys are spending more time on play and entertainment, are going to mosque and pray there and interact with their peers. And so I think one thing that we need to pay extra attention to, and that's definitely a lesson for ourselves, is even more attention to girls, making sure that they have the opportunities to learn, that they have the opportunities to play, because that is as important for learning as formal learning is. Now, we will need to navigate the concerns of families, and I'll build a little bit of a narrative. So one is that we know that parents have reduced their expectations substantially for their children's education. So a fourth of girls' parents and 4 in 10 of boys' parents have reduced their expectations. And if expectations are lowered now, that will translate into behavior and changes tomorrow. And it's not too late to try and address these expectations by giving families more confidence that the school system is ready to take their kids back to remediate the learning losses, and that they are given support from the government to send their children to school. Now, parents, I think, concerns, to give them that confidence, we need to address their concerns, and that most aren't really that much concerned about health, but families are concerned about falling behind in learning, about the price of education. There are concerns about the SOPs. So I think what we're trying to see is that communicating with parents is becoming more important, and I'll try to show you a little bit more. The dropout problem, so parents pulling children back from school, is maybe bigger than we thought, particularly for the age of adolescence. And so our programs will need to respond to this, particularly the age group from 10 onwards. Where we have been immediately focused was on the earlier age group. say 5 to 10, which I think we need to continue that. Let's not say that we should stop that, but have additional programming for the ages 10 to 17 to keep them in school, and again address parental expectations there. Now, one thing that we really were surprised about is that families don't know that much what we are talking about on average in terms of our programming. So the knowledge about the initiatives that governments are running is quite low, with only about 16% of parents being aware of TV learning opportunities, 14% of parents aware of other learning opportunities, and even basic things like the stipends that have been running for a very long time to stay in school, parents aren't really that aware of. And so that's something that I think we can do better on. The participation in remote learning activities really can be improved. And just to give you a sense of how much that can be improved by basic communication is that only about close to 10% of children are really participating actively in remote learning. So that's something that's very low. But by giving, so if they know about their opportunities, about a third of families participate. So just having that basic knowledge really changes the game very fundamentally. And that's something that's not very expensive to communicate, but it's something that we need to do proactively. And then I think where we're sort of focusing on more programmatically is again, and this is maybe a little bit of repetition, but it's one is diagnose what the actual learning losses are, make sure that our teachers are equipped to respond, and then communicating with parents about what they can do. Targeting really the adolescent group at age 10 onwards, using more low-cost tools like text messages, which we can do very fast to increase knowledge about government initiatives and to signal what's important. And then again, as you already asked for before, is to improve our collaboration. So have more of these kinds of conversations with different organizations involved to see how our programs can work together to improve the response and improve coordination in the education system.
Thank you so much, Koen, for explaining what needs to be done to avert this crisis in future and in view of the current pandemic also. We have some time for audience feedback and questions. With your permission, I'd like to invite if there are any questions and feedback from the audience. For the audience, kindly use the raise hand option in case you have a comment or question for Koen. And also, it is kindly requested to keep your comment or question very short so that more people are able to join. Okay, so it's Cham, now you can ask your question.
I can speak now and people can hear me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Koen, for that very insightful presentation, and thank you, Mr. Abdullah, for holding this session. I just have a small comment. Koen shared a statistic where children in Pakistan, I think it was 5th grade children, were performing at the level of schooling level of children, in the United States. My comment was that in Pakistan, this also makes sense, and this is largely because a very large percentage of children who are going to school are first generation schoolgoers. So you see, that's a huge problem here. So this data point might not be a commentary on the efficiency or ineffectiveness of the education system, but it largely, comments on the socioeconomic conditions that we in developing countries face in comparison with countries like United States, England, and so that was just a small comment. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Shall we maybe collect a couple of questions and then I'll respond? Yeah.
So I'll take another question. This is Maqsood Alam. So kindly state your question or a comment, whatever you have. Please. So
can you hear me?
yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you. That's nice, really nice presentation, and we have. I'm very thankful for covering so much issues from field level. But my question with the panelist is, majority of the students from rural area don't have access to digital resources. In remote areas, most of the students don't have proper electricity in their areas. So during the course of pandemic, they are not able to attend classes. And the second thing, the students are not very much interested to take their studies on the television or mobiles. They are usually meant to have cartoons or play video games. Most of the students, when they are asked to sit before television or have a mobile gadget to attend their classes, they don't take serious interest and they are not taking their lessons properly. So this have lost the interest of the students in all three situations I have mentioned. They don't have electricity, they don't have digital gadgets, they are not properly tuned to data education from these devices. So my apprehension is this: with all these factors, we may have a lot more numbers of dropped out students after this pandemic situation. So what should be potential remedial measures to get those students back to their studies and enhance their interest? So we should lose the number of dropped out in schools. Thank you very much for your very nice and synchronized presentation. I'm really thankful for covering the whole pandemic scenario with reference to the challenges in education sector. Thank you.
Okay, so Koen, I'll take another question and then you can respond to the three questions together. So this is Ghulam Nabi Shakir. Kindly state your question or comment, please. You'll have to unmute your mic, please.
My question, not sole question, but comment that I am feeling as a teacher trainer that we have filtered training activity that is a integral part of education. We have brought teachers from a teacher-centered approach to child-centered approach. Uh, but in present scenario, even if we are using all the gadgets properly, we are in a state of frontal teaching that was advisably uh, being avoided before pandemic. But now the conditions are that we are bound to speak, others are passive listeners, and this state of affair is really alarming. Thank you very much.
Kun, I'll stop here and if you can respond to their feedback or comments.
Thank you very much. No, thanks for the great questions. I'll just take them one by one. So Atisham, I think excellent point. These are definitely first generation students, and that problem will continue with us for a while because there are still new first generation students to catch, and I hope we catch them into the school system. So that problem is something we know is going to stay with us. Now, I think the lesson that we need to learn is that our curriculums are apparently not designed for those first generation students. They are maybe designed for the second or the third generation. And so this is something that is quite common in across the developing world or across the low income world, that the curriculums were designed, and maybe the textbooks. I don't want to talk too abstract in terms of the curriculum, but the textbook and the instruction that happens day to day in school is actually at a level that is pitched too high for the children that are receiving that education. And I think that is the challenge, that we shouldn't just say, okay, maybe these kids aren't learning enough because they're first generation. No, in fact, I think what the lesson is, what we teach those children should be at the right level. And I think that's something that we're learning in various programs, and something that we'll try and do a little bit more of. So how to have teachers, say, respond better to the needs of the different children in the classroom. Say, targeting some instruction, maybe sometimes giving different assignments to different groups in the classroom at the level at which those children really are learning. We know now from various studies that those kinds of methods can be effective in raising the bar and raising the level of learning for everyone. So I think I take that point, and that obviously we don't expect Pakistan to be at the level of the United States, but we also don't see why Pakistan can't do as good as Vietnam, or cannot do as good as some provinces, even in South Asia, on its education system. So then the second question on remote learning. I think what you describe is very accurate picture of the reality of remote learning, and maybe we have been a little bit too optimistic about remote learning overall. But I think that was important, because my expectation for remote learning was that at least it would give some sense of continuity and some sense of staying engaged with schooling, even when you're at home, even if many children will not have access or will not have the quality learning experience they would have in the classroom. I think what we're seeing now, maybe it was a little bit worse than we expected, but maybe that's an additional argument to get children back into school and really remediate the learning losses. It's also an argument to try and improve the quality of remote learning and address the digital divide that this pandemic showed is so much a reality going forward. So try and see these as real lessons for improving the policies and the programs that are in existence. Now, the third question, I think, was really very fundamental, which is about teacher training and what teachers really do in the classroom. I think this is an area where Pakistan hasn't done enough and can do more. I've seen some interesting programs take root to help teachers improve. Very innovative teacher training support, and hopefully that's something that I think we're realizing is going to be so much more important. I think there are two things that I find important. One is to standardize very basic practices that every teacher can do in every class, and make sure that teachers actually do those practically, which means asking questions from their students, giving feedback to students who may not understand something that is going on, making sure that there's like some learning, sort of active learning activity in every classroom, and very important also modeling what the teacher is actually doing, making sure that lesson 1 follows up with lesson 2, and that everybody understands what is lesson 1 and what is lesson 2 and how those are related. So how concepts also build upon one another. Now, how do we do that is I think by investing much more in supporting teachers to do that proactively, and looking at what teachers are practically doing in the classroom. So making sure that there's somebody who is a mentor to that teacher, who sits with the teacher in the classroom, who can help the teacher to improve those practices. So making sure that the teacher trainers, which traditionally would sit in maybe a school that is far away from the teacher homeschool, actually bringing that teacher into the class, or the teacher trainer into the classroom and supporting the teacher there, is going to be really key to improving the experience that students have every day in the classroom. So I really that's something that I feel very passionately about, and I'm happy to say that there's been some good initiatives in that space. Abdullah, I think you're muted. I can see you speak, but I can't hear.
Okay. Thank you so much, Koen, for the response. We've already overshooted our time. I'm thankful to the people who were able to join us for this session today, and I'm much more grateful to Koen for your time and talking to us about the learning challenge, the actual challenge that we are facing, and how we can address this challenge in the future. It was really a pleasure to have you with us on this podcast. Hopefully, we aim to engage again sometime, and hopefully with a better news. Thank you so much, Koen.
Yes, next time on a lighter note. Thank you so much, Abdullah, for taking the time and organizing the session, and also having me on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care.